Suddenly, he crashed through a thick wall of bushes. He flew across a ravine and hit the ground with a bump. Thomas slid down a hill. Trees and rocks were everywhere. Help! Thomas cried. At last, Thomas slithered to a stop at the bottom of the hill. He was stuck. Thomas saw he had landed next to an old track. But how am I going to get onto it? He cried. Thomas could do nothing but wait and hope. Thomas! He whistled happily. Is that you? Thomas had run out of puff. He couldn't whistle again. He could only wait. Then Thomas saw Stanley chuffing around the bend. Stanley, he cried, I'm very happy to see you. Thomas, whistled Stanley, where have you been? Did you run away? No, tooted Thomas sadly. I was trying to be a really useful engine. Then Thomas told Stanley all about his adventure in the mine. As he wished. We will be friends, and I'll have you back on that track in no time. Soon, Stanley was hooked up to Thomas. Then Stanley huffed and puffed. Thomas was very heavy. There was a lot of water in his firebox. Stanley didn't give up. I can do it, he wished. And with a mighty heave, Stanley pulled his friend back onto the track. Hooray! Tooted Thomas. Then there was a very loud crack. The valve in Stanley's boiler had burst. Stanley was a very strong engine, but pulling Thomas had been too much. Now he couldn't move. Stanley felt very sad. Don't worry, whistled Thomas. It's my turn to help you. I'll shunt you home. Stanley smiled. Thomas was his new friend. There was nothing Thomas wouldn't do for Stanley. The fireman put Stanley's dry coal into Thomas's firebox. In no time at all, Thomas's boiler was bubbling, and his steam was wheeshing. Here we go, Stanley, Thomas huffed happily. Stanley smiled back. And puff by puff, Thomas shunted Stanley along the track. It was very hard work. Thomas had to puff up hills and huff through bushes. But Thomas didn't mind. He was proud to push his new friend Stanley home.